So, what happens next? Well, shall I tell you what happens next? Because, of course, well, there's a second part to this story. It's Act 2 of Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol. Scrooge had just relived his Christmas past. And he went back to sleep, as you do, only to be woken up again by a voice from outside of his curtains going, "Ho, ho, ho! Ho, ho, ho!" And he opened his curtain again around his bed, and there was a man sitting in his very own armchair. Scrooge was pretty miffed about that. His own armchair, it might have been old and fairly miserable, to be honest, and overused and not that much cleaner than a mop, but still, it was his armchair. But the man was looking terribly jolly, and he was all dressed. No, he wasn't dressed in red at all. He was dressed in green velvet, and he had a very luxuriant beard, and it wasn't white, it was red. And his hair was curly and red, and he had a crown of holly. And he said, "Approach, come along, I've got to take you some places. I am the ghost of Christmas present. Come along, come along." And Scrooge felt like a child once again, and he shuffled along. And the man, he opened the back wall. How bizarre was that? He opened the back wall of the house, and the next thing you knew, they were stepping across the back wall of the house into a house, well, a street in Camden Town. Now, if you've ever been to London, and if you've ever been to Camden Town, it used to be a very working class part of London, and very, very narrow streets with very small, up to down, workmen cottages. And in that street, there was a little cottage, a little terraced house, not a cottage, which was the neatest thing. It was neat as two pins. It was so lovely. And the steps were whitewashed, and everything was gleaming. And on the door, there was a lovely wreath of pine and pine cones. And Scrooge said, "Well, who lives there?" I have no idea who lives there. And he peered through the window, and there was a woman there. Come along, Peter. Peter, where are you? Peter, I need you to come and mind the potatoes. In fact, I also need you to come and help me set the table. Oh, dearie me, what am I going to do? Peter, where are you? Your brothers and sisters have gone off to go and take the goose. Mrs. Cratchit. For it was she. Remember Mr. Cratchit, Bob Cratchit, the clerk. Well, Mrs. Cratchit was a very neat little woman. And she was in her best clothes, which must have been somebody else's best clothes before hers, because they were fairly old but very neat. And she was bustling around like anything, because it was Christmas Day and she had to organise everything. And the children had been sent already with the goose to be cooked at the baker's, because of course they were not rich people. They didn't have an oven or anything like that. And the potatoes were cooking on the fire. And she was waiting for Martha. Where is Martha? Peter, can you imagine what's happened to your sister? Well, it so happens that poor Martha, who was all of 12, well, she was a milliner apprentice. And she's been kept back, I suppose. Oh, my God, please, not on Christmas Day. Oh, such a terrible travail. But all was well. And soon Peter had been found. The potato had been ponked with a fork, and the goose had been delivered to the baker's, and the table had been set. And it was just a door, the door of between the kitchen and the front room. It was a door. They took the hinges off, and they had two little stools that they put the door on, and it'd been covered by a sheet. And oh my, it looked lovely. And at about that point, Martha arrived. "Oh, thank God for that," said Mrs. Cratchit, and was sat down next to the fire because she was a bit chilled, poor child. And lo and behold, Bob Cratchit himself came, and on his shoulder was Tiny Tim, who was his youngest child. And Scrooge looked at Tiny Tim on his father's shoulder and noticed that he was wearing a crutch. He was carrying a crutch in his arm. And he said to the ghost, "Is something wrong with Tiny Tim? I didn't realise that Scrooge had so many, that Bob has too many children. Why do they have so many children? I mean, they're very poor, aren't they? The ghost's Christmas present, he sighed and said, love. Have you ever heard of love? And sadly, Scrooge didn't really quite remember, did he? Anyway, Tiny Tim was dropped down and he limped away to another chair, and everybody sat down, and Tiny Tim said something that he'd kind of got rather accustomed to saying, and well, Mrs. Cratchit wasn't that much in favour of it because it was very irritating. Everybody thought it was terribly cute, but Mrs. Cratchit didn't. It was very annoying. Tiny Tim would say, God bless us, everyone, at the drop of a hat. And that's mostly because he started doing that in church and people had patted him on the head and told him how sweet he was. Anyway, they all sat down and they had the most amazing meal. Gosh, the goose. Scrooge thought it was rather like a big chicken. But anyway, a goose it was. The goose fed everyone, which is a miracle because it was a very small goose and a very large family. But they all declared themselves to be stuffed to the gunnels, and they started to mix some brandy and water, and they're going to put the toast together. And Mrs. Cratchit was so worried about the Christmas pudding. Was the Christmas pudding going to be okay? Oh, it was all right. It was outside in the copper, boiling to be warmed up. And finally he was brought out and the brandy was poured over it and it was set aflame. Oh, it was a triumphant success. But before Bob Cratchit started to dish it out, he said, stop, everybody get a drink into your mug. And they didn't have glasses, not really. They had odd mugs, you know. And everybody put a bit of a drink in their bottle, in their mug, and Bob Cratchit stood up and he said, I want us to honour the founder of this feast. No, I will not drink the health of this miserable man. Your boss is terrible. It is not going to happen, said Mrs. Cratchit. I will not drink to his health. Now, my dear, said Bob Cratchit. Now, my dear. And Scrooge was astonished. He was astonished on two different levels. One was, why on earth did Mrs. Cratchit think that he wasn't a good man? What? He was paying Bob's salary. Why wouldn't she drink his health? Why did she keep saying he was an old miser? Well, Scrooge never thought of himself as an old miser. Prudent, for sure, but an old miser, don't think so. Anyway, and the other thing that was puzzling him was, why would she... What? Oh, well, never mind. It's gone out of his mind now. He couldn't remember, but he kept thinking back to Tiny Tim. Oh, what had happened? What would happen to Tiny Tim? And as they walked away from the house in Camden Town, he turned to the jolly man with the green velvet outfit and said, what will happen to Tiny Tim? Oh, said the man, I don't know. I can't see in the future. But he looked awfully pale, didn't he? And Scrooge thought of that other boy. Do you remember him? The one in the first act. That little boy that was abandoned in that horrible boarding house. And he thought, maybe he could have done something to help if he'd asked, if he'd known. But there was very, very little time to do anything because they were whooshed away to a little house in Bloomsbury, which was slightly posher. And it was a lovely little house. And again, there was a garland on the door, a better one. And there's two people standing there knocking on the door. One of them was Topper, who was the best friend of Fred. Do you remember Fred? Fred, the nephew? Well, Topper was there, who had met accidentally Rose's sister. Rose's sister doesn't have a name either. But Rose's sister and Topper, well, Rose had rather a lot of hope that Topper would finally declare himself on this very day, on Christmas Day. It would be wonderful. They could all celebrate. And Fred and Rose opened the door and everybody went in and settled down at the table. But Fred was fidgety. He kept looking towards the door and wondering. And Rose said, would you please stop fidgeting like that? He's not coming, is he? He never does. And Fred said, I don't know. I'm hoping every year that he will. Oh, I wish he would. And, Scrooge, who was watching all this, of course, having entered at the same time as Topper and his sister, felt kind of strange fluttering in his heart and thought to himself, I wonder what it would be like to go. I really do. What would it be like? But then again, there was a passing moment and then they all ate and were merry and they played games and it was just lovely. And you know what happened? Scrooge started playing the games. So did the man in the velvet suit. They both did it. And Scrooge was dancing round and playing charades and trying to guess. And it was most peculiar because he was actually enjoying himself in a major way. But then it was soon time to leave and Topper said he would go and escort the sister. They'd been rather canoodling behind the curtains when they thought nobody was watching them. And Rose pushed them out the door. Just get on with it, will you please? Just get on, propose, do something. And then she stood on her doorstep. And in the twilight, in the gloom of the twilight, she thought she saw something quite odd. There was an old man in a dressing gown and a nightshirt with a nightcap on his head, dancing away, all on his own, going tick-tick-tick, tick-tick-tick. And then she rubbed her eyes and there's nothing there. She thought to herself, I've had too much brandy, haven't I? She went to bed. And so did Scrooge, who suddenly found himself back in his bed. The jolly man was gone, and he had much to think about. Only, he just went back to sleep. And that is part 2 of A Christmas Carol, The Ghost of Christmas Present. And I hope you enjoyed it. And part 3 will be coming very soon, because we still have the ghost of Christmas future to look forward to. And how does the story end? Wouldn't you like to know?